They lied to you. Your teachers lied to you. Don't get mad at me for exposing the truth. But the man who first crossed the Atlantic and reached the Americas wasn't Italian. He wasn't even European. Before you start crying about it, give me 30 seconds to explain. Almost 200 years before Columbus set sail, an African king named Abu Bakr II ruled the Mali Empire, one of the richest, most advanced civilizations in the world. This wasn't some minor tribal leader. He commanded gold, knowledge, and fleets of ships, so massive that the horizon disappeared beneath their sails. Abu Bakr didn't just dream of exploration, he lived it. He studied the winds, charted the stars, and assembled a fleet larger than anything Europe would attempt for centuries. When he decided to explore the unknown, he didn't send one ship, he sent hundreds. And when those ships failed to return, he took the helm himself, leaving behind a throne for his brother, Mansa Musa, the richest man in history. It's a truth your textbooks will never admit. Africa was already discovering the world while Europe fumbled in darkness. And the story doesn't end there. Another name you've probably never heard is Estevão the Moor, a black navigator who sailed under the Spanish and Portuguese flags, guiding fleets across oceans that Europeans claimed to discover. When Columbus finally reached the Caribbean, indigenous people told him something shocking. Black men had already been there, generations before. They spoke of visitors with gold, dark skin, and knowledge of the stars far beyond what European sailors understood. Columbus himself wrote about it, but centuries of historians erased it, labeling African navigators as myths, coincidences, or exaggerations. This story rewrites everything you thought you knew about exploration. It proves that black excellence didn't begin with survival. It began with innovation, courage, and curiosity. Africa wasn't waiting for Europe to discover it. Africa was leading the way, and the waves still remember their names. The Mali Empire wasn't a mere kingdom tucked away in the sands of West Africa. It was a superpower, a civilization of wealth, knowledge, and sophistication that rivaled any in Europe at the time. Stretching from the fertile banks of the Niger River deep into the shifting expanse of the Sahara, the empire thrived on trade, intellect, and ambition. Gold wasn't just a symbol of wealth here. It coursed through the veins of the empire, the lifeblood that funded fleets, libraries, and the dreams of men who refused to accept the limits imposed by geography or prejudice. Salt, ivory, and other precious commodities flowed like rivers, connecting the cities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne to the wider world, from the coasts of the Mediterranean to the caravan routes of the Sahara. These cities weren't just points on a map, they were centers of civilization, the beating heart of an empire that Europe would only pretend to understand centuries later. Timbuktu alone was a marvel. It was a city of scholars, philosophers, and scribes. Its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts, painstakingly copied and preserved in Arabic, Songhai, and other African languages. These texts weren't just simple writings, they were encyclopedias of knowledge. Astronomy, medicine, algebra, law, ethics, and history were all recorded, analyzed, and debated within its walls. For centuries, scholars would travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles, to study in Timbuktu's renowned institutions. Europe, meanwhile, was still grappling with the Dark Ages, where knowledge was scarce, learning was confined to a few monasteries, and the stars themselves were feared rather than studied. Abu Bakr II was born into this world of intellect and ambition. He inherited more than just the throne. He inherited a vision of possibility. While most rulers were content to consolidate power, collect taxes, and oversee the trade of gold and salt, Abu Bakr's mind was already set on something greater, something that would challenge the boundaries of the known world. From the moment he took the throne, he asked a question few dared to even whisper: what lies beyond the horizon? where the Mediterranean sailors feared storms and monsters, where European mariners assumed the ocean ended in nothingness. Abu Bakr saw opportunity, exploration, and discovery. Abu Bakr's reign was marked by unprecedented organization and ambition. He invested in fleets, training a generation of navigators who would rival any sailor of Europe or Arabia. He commissioned ships large enough to cross the Atlantic, equipped with the knowledge of currents, winds, and stars that had been passed down through centuries of African seafaring. These weren't small fishing vessels or coastal boats. These were ocean-going ships designed to survive months at sea, capable of carrying hundreds of men, supplies, and the gold and knowledge of Mali. Every detail, the hull, the sails, the navigation, reflected the empire's wealth and intellect. But Abu Bakr's ambition wasn't just personal, it was deeply tied to the philosophy of Mali. The empire didn't see itself as isolated. It understood the world as a network of trade, knowledge, and human potential. Knowledge was power, and exploration was a way to extend that power beyond the visible horizon. The libraries of Timbuktu and Gao weren't just for record-keeping. They were workshops for innovation, planning, and experimentation. Scholars calculated the stars, charted winds, and predicted ocean currents long before Europe developed compasses or chronometers. Maps were drawn with precision, showing not only the African coastline, but the paths to unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. Abu Bakr didn't keep his ambitions a secret. He spoke openly of sending fleets westward, to explore lands unseen, to make contact with peoples unknown, and to expand the understanding of the world. Chroniclers of the time, such as Al-Umari, recorded that he launched expedition after expedition. One fleet returned, a few ships lost, some men never seen again. Most rulers would have stopped there. Most rulers would have seen the ocean as a limit, a boundary not meant to be crossed. But Abu Bakr had a vision bigger than fear. He prepared another fleet, larger, stronger, more daring than the first. And when he saw the pattern of the stars, the rhythm of the winds, and the currents guiding him west, he made a choice that would rewrite history. He would lead the voyage himself. The Mali Empire under Abu Bakr II was more than wealth or power. It was a civilization that understood the principles of science, the flow of trade, and the art of leadership. Soldiers, sailors, and scholars all understood their role in this mission. They weren't merely explorers, they were the embodiment of African excellence, trained not only to survive the ocean, but to thrive upon it. And when the fleet set sail, the world, or at least the version of the world written in European textbooks, had no idea that history was being made. Abu Bakr's vision challenged not just geography, but the assumptions of history. Europe believed that exploration and discovery were their domain. They believed the New World was a blank canvas for their ambition. But centuries before Columbus would sail across the Atlantic, a black African emperor had already turned the ocean into a highway, guided by knowledge, ambition, and courage. This wasn't myth. This was Mali. This was Abu Bakr II, and the legacy of that vision, the libraries, the scholars, the fleets, and the courage, would ripple across continents, even if Europe tried to bury it. The Mali Empire, with Timbuktu at its heart, was a civilization that understood the power of knowledge and the necessity of exploration. Abu Bakr II didn't just inherit a kingdom, he inherited a responsibility to expand the reach of African intellect and presence across the globe. And in doing so, he left a mark on history that, while erased from many textbooks, still echoes in the currents of the Atlantic, in the manuscripts of Timbuktu, and in the stories passed down by generations of African scholars. Abu Bakr's vision wasn't just about crossing the ocean, it was about showing the world that Africa was not waiting for Europe. Africa was leading, guiding, and discovering long before the so-called Age of Exploration ever began. And this understanding, once revealed, changes everything we thought we knew about history, about civilization, and about who truly discovered the world. Imagine standing on the edge of the African coast in the early 14th century, staring out at an endless expanse of water. The horizon ripples with sunlight, waves shimmering like gold, and there, stretching as far as the eye can see, are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of ships, sails unfurled, flags snapping in the wind. This is not a scene from a dream. This was the fleet of Abu Bakr II, Emperor of Mali, a man who refused to let the ocean define the limits of possibility. Abu Bakr didn't merely commission a few ships for exploration. He built an armada that would dwarf the vessels of European nations centuries later. Some chroniclers suggest the fleet numbered over 2,000 ships. Others believe there were thousands more. These weren't small boats. They were ocean-going vessels, capable of enduring storms, carrying supplies for months, and housing crews of skilled sailors, navigators, and scholars. Every ship was a floating extension of the Mali Empire, equipped with tools, charts, and knowledge that had been refined over generations of African seafaring. The people aboard these ships were not wanderers or mercenaries. They were scientists, astronomers, cartographers, and skilled craftsmen, the best of Mali's intellectual elite. Some had spent years studying the stars, learning the rhythms of the ocean, and understanding the winds that would carry them across unknown waters. The Atlantic was not a mystery to them. It was a highway they had mapped in their minds and in meticulous records. They followed the patterns of currents and trade winds that later guided Columbus, but these paths had been used, tested, and understood long before Europe ever dared to dream of transatlantic voyages. Abu Bakr's preparation for this journey was meticulous. He consulted with Timbuktu's greatest scholars, who calculated distances, charted stars, and observed celestial movements to determine the best time to depart. Supplies were organized with precision: food, water, tools, navigation instruments, and most importantly, knowledge. Each ship carried manuscripts detailing observations of the heavens, instructions for navigation, and records of previous coastal voyages. This wasn't just an expedition, it was a floating university, a moving archive of African genius. When the time came, Abu Bakr did something no other emperor would dare. He didn't just send his ships, he led the fleet himself. The emperor of one of the richest empires on earth took the helm, stepping onto the lead ship as thousands of men awaited orders. Imagine the courage it took, leaving behind his throne, the gold and wealth of Mali, to face the unknown. Many men feared the ocean, many rulers feared the risk, but Abu Bakr understood that exploration was not about fear, it was about vision. The horizon was not a boundary, it was a challenge. As the fleet sailed westward, chroniclers would later write that the horizon seemed endless. The waters, stretching like a silver desert. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Storms battered the ships, and rough seas tested the resolve of every sailor aboard. Yet Abu Bakr remained steadfast, guiding his armada with wisdom, skill, and unwavering determination. One ship, some accounts suggest, returned, bringing news of distant lands and confirming the patterns of currents and winds. Most of the others were lost to history, their fate uncertain. But even in absence, they left a mark. They carried Mali's ambition across the ocean and planted the seeds of African exploration in lands previously thought unreachable. What makes Abu Bakr's voyage revolutionary is not only its scale but its purpose. He wasn't seeking conquest, gold, or colonial domination. He sought knowledge. He sought understanding. He sought to answer the question that had defined his reign: what lies beyond the horizon? And in doing so, he reshaped the very concept of exploration. Long before European nations dispatched fleets to claim territories and riches, Africa was leading the way. Mali's navigators weren't following maps. They were creating them in real time, guided by intellect, courage, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. The implications of this journey are staggering. When Europeans later sailed across the Atlantic, they believed they were discovering lands, civilizations, and resources that had been hidden. Yet the truth, if fully acknowledged, tells a different story. Africans had reached the Americas long before Columbus. Indigenous peoples spoke of dark-skinned visitors arriving from the east, bearing gold and speaking unknown tongues. Metalwork and carvings in the Americas bear the hallmarks of African craftsmanship. These were not coincidences. These were fingerprints, evidence of Mali's mastery of the seas. Abu Bakr II's fleet was more than a naval expedition. It was a declaration. It announced to the world that Africa was not a passive continent, waiting for Europe to discover it. Africa was active, intelligent, and powerful, mapping oceans, studying the stars, and shaping the future of exploration centuries ahead of Europe. And while history books attempted to erase this truth, the evidence remains. In the currents that carried ships westward, in manuscripts preserved in Timbuktu, and in the oral histories of peoples across continents. The legacy of Abu Bakr II challenges everything we thought we knew about exploration. Europe may have taken credit, but the reality is clear. The first great transatlantic voyage, the first systematic attempt to understand the world beyond the known horizon, was led by a black African emperor. His courage, intellect, and ambition crossed oceans and centuries alike, leaving behind a story that the world is only beginning to rediscover. As Abu Bakr II's fleet pressed into the vast Atlantic, the ocean transformed from a barrier into a bridge, a corridor of possibility stretching between Africa and lands unknown. These were not voyages of chance. They were meticulously planned expeditions, guided by knowledge accumulated over generations of West African seafarers. The fleet's sailors understood the currents and winds as intimately as a shepherd knows his flock, reading the oceans like a living map and navigating by the stars with precision that would astonish later European explorers. Imagine the scene: hundreds of ships, their wooden hulls creaking, sails taut in the wind, African navigators calling directions, adjusting for tides and storms. Abu Bakr, standing at the lead, surveyed the horizon with unshakable focus. His eyes were fixed on a question that had haunted empires for centuries: what lies beyond the edge of the known world? His ambition was not conquest, nor the accumulation of gold, but knowledge, a thirst to understand the planet itself, to chart the uncharted, and to expand the horizons of human possibility. Reports from indigenous peoples centuries later describe visitors from the east, dark-skinned men adorned with gold, speaking foreign tongues, wielding metal tools unknown in the Americas. These weren't myths. They were witnesses to history that European narratives would later suppress. Archaeologists have uncovered African-style metalwork in South America and the Caribbean, copper alloys, identical to those used in Mali during its golden age. Even the carvings, faces with broad noses and full lips, echo the features of West African peoples. These traces suggest that Abu Bakr's fleet left an imprint across continents, reshaping the story of transoceanic contact long before Columbus. But history did not favor truth. As Abu Bakr and his fleet ventured further, Europe remained locked in the Dark Ages, struggling to grasp the globe as anything more than a flat, perilous expanse. African mariners, in contrast, moved with confidence, guided by empirical observation and centuries of maritime tradition. They didn't need compasses or European tools. Their charts were the stars, their compasses were the winds, and their maps were etched into memory and manuscripts. They were scientists as much as explorers, combining intellect with courage in ways the world was slow to recognize. And yet, when only a portion of the fleet returned, or when word of their sightings reached Mali, chroniclers documented it with reverence. Abu Bakr's absence from history wasn't due to failure. It was a consequence of a world unprepared to acknowledge African achievement. The very act of African men crossing the Atlantic challenged the narrative that Europe had discovered the world. The empire that had nurtured them was already centuries ahead, capable of feats Europe would only dream of generations later. The political implications of this voyage were profound. Abu Bakr's departure signified a passing of power to his brother, Mansa Musa, who would become the richest man in history. Musa inherited not just a throne but a vision, a legacy of ambition that had propelled Mali onto the global stage. Under Musa, the empire would continue to flourish, but the stories of his brother's oceanic journey would be quietly erased, hidden beneath the sands of time and the agendas of later historians. Europe, meanwhile, would continue its narrative of discovery, oblivious or willfully ignorant of Africa's mastery of the seas. When Columbus sailed centuries later, he followed currents and winds charted by African navigators. The very maps he used were built upon the knowledge transmitted across generations, knowledge originating not in the courts of Spain or Portugal, but in the libraries, temples, and ports of West Africa. Every Atlantic crossing Europe celebrated had been preceded by African intelligence and ambition. This truth reframes everything. It dismantles the notion that the Americas were discovered by Europeans, and it restores Africa to its rightful place as a pioneering force in human exploration. Abu Bakr II voyage was not a singular anomaly. It was the culmination of centuries of African maritime skill, scholarship, and curiosity. The ocean itself became a record of African ingenuity, a testament to a civilization that refused to remain passive while others claimed the stage. And yet, as you look at textbooks, maps, and history books today, the name Abu Bakr II, his ships, his sailors, and his discoveries are footnotes, whispers drowned out by centuries of European narrative control. But the evidence cannot be silenced. Currents, winds, artifacts, and oral traditions all point to a remarkable truth. African explorers reached across the Atlantic long before the age of exploration. The fleet's journey was more than exploration. It was defiance. It challenged assumptions about who could chart the world, who could command the seas, and who could shape history. Abu Bakr II's vision did not end with the horizon. It transformed the understanding of African capability, ambition, and intellect. While Europe rewrote the story to erase him, the echoes of his fleet resonate across continents and centuries. By reconstructing this narrative, we reclaim a history of innovation, courage, and global influence. Abu Bakr II's voyage reminds us that exploration is not the province of a single continent or culture. It is a human endeavor, one that Africa mastered long before others took the credit. The world may have forgotten, but the ocean remembers, and history is finally beginning to listen. By the time Abu Bakr II's fleet returned, or, in many cases, failed to return, the world had already begun reshaping the story. Europe's scribes and mapmakers, centuries later, would record voyages across the Atlantic, but African names were conspicuously absent. Columbus, Vespucci, and Magellan filled the pages, celebrated as the discoverers of new worlds. Abu Bakr II, his sailors, the true pioneers, were rendered invisible. It was as if the ocean itself had swallowed their names, leaving only a silent testament in currents and wind patterns. The act of erasure was not accidental. When European powers colonized Africa and the Americas, they needed a narrative that justified conquest. A story where the New World was unknown, empty, and waiting to be discovered suited their purposes perfectly. Acknowledging that African mariners had reached the Americas centuries earlier would undermine the foundations of colonial authority. It would expose a world in which Africans were not passive subjects, but the architects of exploration, science, and civilization. Consider the evidence. Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and South America left records of visitors with dark skin, speaking foreign languages, and bringing metal tools unlike anything previously seen. Metal work from Mali has been found in the Amazon and along the Brazilian coast. Copper and bronze alloys, identical to those produced in West Africa during the Mali Empire's height. Ancient carvings depict faces with full lips and broad noses, reflecting the physical traits of African sailors. These artifacts are fingerprints of a journey that Europe tried to erase, fingerprints that refuse to vanish. Historians like Alumari chronicled Abu Bakr's expedition, noting how the fleet was constructed, how the sailors were trained, and how the currents were studied. Yet these writings were ignored, misinterpreted, or dismissed in Western academia. Even when explorers like Columbus encountered accounts of dark-skinned visitors in the Americas, the information was minimized or reinterpreted to fit a Eurocentric framework. The truth was too disruptive. To admit it would mean acknowledging that Africa had reached beyond the known world, shaping history before Europe could claim any part of it. This systematic erasure extended beyond maps and books. The instruments, charts, and knowledge used by Abu Bakr's navigators were appropriated, translated, and reframed as European achievements. What Europe called discovery was often borrowing, following routes already charted by Africans, using methods refined over generations. The currents that carried Columbus westward were long understood by African sailors. The winds that filled his sails had been studied for decades, and the stars he navigated by had been catalogued centuries before his voyage. Abu Bakr II's legacy also had a human cost. He left the throne to his brother, Mansa Musa, who inherited not only Mali's wealth, but also the responsibility of preserving the empire's maritime knowledge. Abu Bakr's decision to personally lead the fleet, risking never to return, reflected a vision that prioritized discovery and learning over political power or material gain. He knew that knowledge was more valuable than gold, a principle that continues to define Africa's contributions to science and culture. When European chroniclers rewrote history, they sanitized the record. Maps were redrawn to remove African influence. Textbooks celebrated Europeans as the discoverers of continents already visited and mapped by Abu Bakr's fleets. Even centuries later, popular culture continues to perpetuate the myth that the Americas were discovered in 1492, ignoring the sophisticated seafaring traditions of West Africa. But the traces remain. Ocean currents, star charts, metallurgical evidence, and oral histories all point to a reality that cannot be fully erased. Modern archaeology in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the Americas reveals African craftsmanship predating European contact. Timbuktu manuscripts describe voyages across the ocean, navigation techniques, and the exchange of goods and knowledge. These documents, hidden in clay walls, preserved by families, and rediscovered centuries later, testify to a forgotten history of African exploration. Abu Bakr II's story challenges everything taught in schools. It reframes history, not as a series of European conquests, but as a global dialogue, one in which Africa played a central role. It forces a reckoning with the selective memory of historians who prioritized empire-building narratives over truth, and it restores agency to a people who were not merely passengers on history's journey, but captains and architects of their own destinies. To truly understand the magnitude of Abu Bakr's achievement, imagine the courage it took to sail into the unknown. Each vessel represented not just a ship, but a repository of knowledge, skill, and innovation. Each navigator carried the weight of centuries of African wisdom, and when those ships reached distant shores, they connected continents, laid the foundations for cultural exchange, and challenged the Eurocentric view of history that would dominate for centuries. By reconstructing this narrative, we honor the explorers, scholars, and visionaries of Africa who defied the limits imposed upon them. Abu Bakr II's Atlantic voyage was not just a physical journey, it was a statement of intellectual and cultural sovereignty, a declaration that African civilizations had already mastered the world's oceans long before Europe claimed to. The Atlantic remembers, the currents, the winds, and the artifacts whisper the truth. Africa's explorers came first, and as the historical record is corrected, the legacy of Abu Bakr II emerges not as a footnote but as a cornerstone in the story of global exploration. When Abu Bakr II set sail, he was not merely embarking on a voyage, he was stepping into the unknown with the confidence of centuries of African maritime knowledge behind him. Each ship in his fleet, meticulously constructed, carried crews trained in navigation, astronomy, and oceanography. They understood the trade winds, the Atlantic currents, and the rhythm of the waves. Knowledge passed down through generations of West African sailors. This was not luck, this was mastery. The fleet moved westward, a moving city of timber, sails, and human determination. Hundreds of vessels stretched as far as the eye could see, their white sails catching the sun, the sound of coordinated chants echoing across the waters. These men were not adventurers in search of plunder, they were scientists, explorers, and visionaries guided by the stars. Each journey was calculated, precise, and grounded in empirical knowledge. As they crossed the Atlantic, the crew relied on the sky as their compass. The North Star guided them at night. Constellations charted in Timbuktu manuscripts mapped their path, and ocean currents carried them like invisible highways across the open sea. These navigators did not rely on chance. They followed centuries of observation. The methods they employed predated European techniques by generations. The Atlantic was no longer a mystery. It had become a canvas for African innovation and courage. But the voyage was perilous. Storms rose without warning, waves towered like mountains, and the horizon seemed infinite. Yet Abu Bakr II remained undeterred. Reports suggest that even when storms destroyed some of the fleet, he pressed onward, undaunted. Each setback became a lesson. Each lost ship was replaced with new vessels, stronger and better equipped. Abu Bakr himself would eventually join the expedition in person, demonstrating a level of commitment and bravery unparalleled in recorded history. While Europe speculated about the shape of the earth and debated myths of sea monsters, Africa was actively charting the globe. Abu Bakr's fleet crossed waters Europeans would only dare navigate centuries later. Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and South America recorded encounters with African sailors who arrived long before Columbus. They described visitors with dark skin, gold ornaments, and advanced metal tools, a testament to the sophistication of Mali's maritime technology. Every island they approached, every coastline they mapped, became part of an intricate web of knowledge. These discoveries were not kept secret. They were recorded meticulously in the archives of Timbuktu, in manuscripts detailing currents, stars, and the locations of distant lands. Abu Bakr II's expedition was both a scientific mission and a cultural exchange, linking continents through observation, documentation, and diplomacy. Yet, despite their accomplishments, the fleet's journey would be obscured for centuries. When European explorers like Columbus arrived, they found lands already known to African sailors. Indigenous oral histories spoke of their earlier arrivals, but these accounts were dismissed, ignored, or rewritten. Maps were drawn without African names. Chronicles of discovery erased the true pioneers, crediting Europe for paths already navigated. The erasure of Abu Bakr II's voyage demonstrates the power of narrative control. By obscuring African achievements, history recast the Atlantic as a new world, waiting for European discovery. The truth that Mali's explorers had reached the Americas, that they had mapped stars and currents, that they had sailed boldly into uncharted waters, was deliberately hidden. Yet traces remain, waiting for those willing to uncover them. Consider the sophistication required to sustain such an expedition. The fleet needed provisioning, coordination, and logistics on a scale unmatched at the time. Abu Bakr's engineers designed ships capable of withstanding Atlantic storms. His navigators calculated distances, monitored winds, and maintained precise records. This was not the reckless adventure that European mythology depicts. It was an organized visionary undertaking that combined science, leadership, and courage. By venturing into the unknown, Abu Bakr II challenged assumptions about Africa's place in history. The continent was not a passive recipient of knowledge, it was the origin. Its scholars, sailors, and engineers were active participants in global exploration. Every manuscript, every chart, every observation reaffirmed the intellectual and technological prowess of West Africa. Abu Bakr's courage set the stage for future generations. While Europe scrambled to claim distant lands, Mali had already demonstrated the possibilities of exploration. This was a story of agency, of African civilizations asserting control over their destiny, and of knowledge that traveled beyond borders and oceans, long before colonial powers could impose their narratives. And though centuries would pass before the world recognized his achievements, Abu Bakr II's legacy survived. His fleet, his maps, and his meticulous records left a silent imprint across the Atlantic. The ocean remembers. Currents, winds, and islands all bear testimony to the African explorers who sailed before Europe claimed the seas. This voyage was not just a crossing of water, it was a crossing of history. It challenged assumptions, defied erasure, and illuminated Africa's central role in global civilization. Abu Bakr II did not merely navigate the Atlantic, he navigated the narrative of history itself, leaving a legacy that cannot be ignored. As Abu Bakr II's fleet pressed westward, the horizon slowly revealed new lands, islands, and coastlines that had never seen African sails. The moment was monumental, though silent to the annals of European history. These were not chance discoveries. They were calculated steps, guided by knowledge, observation, and centuries of maritime expertise. Each landing became a point of contact, a moment of exchange, a statement that Africa had reached the Americas long before Columbus ever set foot on a ship. The first encounters were with indigenous peoples who were already thriving across the islands of the Caribbean. Oral histories preserved by these communities tell of dark-skinned visitors arriving from the east, wearing gold ornaments, speaking unfamiliar tongues, and bringing knowledge of metalworking and navigation. They were not seen as invaders, but as extraordinary visitors, skilled, disciplined, and formidable. These accounts align with the careful records kept in Mali, indicating that the African visitors were explorers with intentions rooted in understanding and trade, not conquest. Abu Bakr's fleet did more than just sail. It charted, the captains measured coastlines, mapped bays, recorded currents, and observed the stars with precision. They cataloged plants, animals, and topography. Their observations would have provided invaluable knowledge to anyone who followed, creating a blueprint for transatlantic travel that centuries later would guide European explorers. But this knowledge was never claimed by Europe. It was African, meticulously recorded, and quietly left in the memory of those who witnessed it. Every interaction with indigenous peoples was careful and deliberate. The Africans shared tools and ideas, demonstrating the use of metals unknown to the local populations. They observed customs, recorded local geography, and respected local hierarchies. The accounts suggest a level of diplomacy and cultural exchange far beyond what the myths of discovery imply. This was not colonization, it was connection. It was Africa asserting its presence on the world stage through knowledge and exploration. Meanwhile, back in Mali, Abu Bakr's absence did not halt the flow of knowledge. Chronicles in Timbuktu continued to record the voyage. Scholars documented the fleet's departure, its progress, and its expected returns. Letters, codices, and oral traditions ensured that the memory of the expedition survived, even as Europe began writing its version of the Atlantic as a blank canvas waiting for European explorers to discover. Yet not all ships returned. Some vanished in storms, lost to the Atlantic, swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. This was no failure. Each loss reinforced the courage and determination of those who continued. Abu Bakr himself eventually stepped aboard his lead ship, leading from the front, demonstrating that leadership was inseparable from action. The survival of the fleet was secondary to the completion of the mission to explore, to map, to record, to assert Africa's presence on the global stage. Archaeological evidence across the Americas hints at African contact before Columbus. Metalwork found in South America mirrors West African techniques. Certain carvings depict features consistent with African physiognomy. Trade routes show patterns that align with what Abu Bakr's fleet could have established. While European historians often dismiss these as coincidence, the precision and sophistication suggest deliberate exploration. Abu Bakr II and his crew left their fingerprints across an entire hemisphere, though history worked to erase them. The fleet's journey also challenged prevailing ideas about the ocean. Europe imagined the Atlantic as a barrier, filled with monsters and endless horizons. Mali had long understood it as a pathway. The currents, winds, and stars were their guides. They treated the ocean as a teacher, not an obstacle. The success of the voyage shattered myths of African ignorance and European exceptionalism, even if the world refused to acknowledge it at the time. Abu Bakr's vision extended beyond mere navigation. He saw Africa as a center of intellectual and exploratory power, capable of shaping global history. His fleet symbolized not just exploration, but a claim to knowledge, innovation, and influence that Europe would later attempt to suppress. By reaching the Americas first, the Mali Empire established a precedent that African civilization had the means, courage, and intellect to chart the globe centuries before European intervention. The legacy of this voyage is subtle yet powerful. Indigenous narratives, archaeological traces, and African manuscripts preserve fragments of the story. They remind us that history is not solely written by the conquerors. Knowledge, courage, and innovation can transcend erasure. Abu Bakr II's expedition is a testament to that truth. In the end, the African explorers returned, some immediately, some never. Those who made it back carried stories, maps, and observations that would inspire generations. Even if Europe refused to credit them, the Atlantic bore witness. Every island, every coastline, every current remembers the African fleet that sailed into the unknown. The voyage of Abu Bakr II was not merely a journey across the ocean, it was a journey across time, a statement that Africa had reached the Americas first. It challenges the myths of European discovery and reclaims a history stolen for centuries. Every wave that lapped against those distant shores whispered of African ingenuity, bravery, and vision, truths that remain undeniable today. As Abu Bakr II's fleet pressed further into the Atlantic, subtle traces of their presence began to mark the Americas. These were not flags, monuments, or inscriptions meant for conquest. They were signs of observation, culture, and exchange. The Africans aboard the ships carried knowledge, technology, and the understanding of the world that had been cultivated over centuries in Mali, Timbuktu, and other centers of learning. They introduced ideas and materials that indigenous peoples recorded in their own ways, leaving echoes that historians often ignore. From the Caribbean islands to the northern reaches of South America, there are accounts, oral traditions, carvings, and artifacts that hint at African visitors arriving long before Columbus. Indigenous communities describe dark-skinned travelers who wore gold and wielded tools crafted from metals not yet known in the New World. These visitors were not invaders, they were emissaries of a sophisticated civilization, moving with purpose and discipline. Their interactions were cautious and respectful, suggesting a level of diplomacy that Europe would later claim as its own hallmark. Archaeological evidence increasingly supports these accounts. Metal alloys discovered in Brazil closely match West African techniques from the Mali Golden Age. Certain stone carvings in Mexico and the Andes depict facial features more consistent with African physiognomy than European. Trade patterns along the coastlines reveal materials and craftsmanship that could only have been introduced by seafaring cultures capable of transatlantic navigation. While some scholars dismiss these findings as coincidence, the precision and alignment with known African practices point to deliberate exploration. Abu Bakr's fleet also brought knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and navigation. They observed the stars as guides, measured ocean currents, and noted the behavior of winds, creating charts that would have allowed future travelers to navigate safely. The African understanding of the Atlantic was comprehensive. The currents, the trade winds, and the natural rhythms of the ocean were not obstacles but tools for exploration. In contrast, European sailors would later struggle with the same waters, relying on chance, guesswork, and centuries of trial and error. Every landing point became a moment of exchange. Indigenous communities witnessed the construction of ships, the use of iron and bronze, and the careful organization of crews. They saw Africans who were trained not only in sailing, but in astronomy, mathematics, and science, disciplines often erased from the African narrative in European textbooks. This exchange was subtle but profound, a meeting of knowledge and culture that left a lasting impression. The fleet's records, preserved in Timbuktu and other West African archives, describe these interactions in detail. Scribes noted the appearance of new lands, the local flora and fauna, and the customs of the people they encountered. These were not casual observations, they were meticulous records, intended to expand the empire's understanding of the world. It was an intellectual expedition as much as a maritime one. Yet, when Europe finally crossed the Atlantic centuries later, the memory of Abu Bakr's fleet had been obscured. Maps omitted the African voyages, attributing discovery to figures like Columbus. Written records were rewritten or ignored. Histories were sanitized to fit a narrative where Europe appeared as the bold, pioneering force, and Africa was portrayed as passive, waiting to be discovered. The reality was far different. Africa had already shaped the trajectory of the New World, laying the groundwork for exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. The voyage also challenged assumptions about leadership and courage. Abu Bakr II himself led from the front, boarding the lead ship, demonstrating that exploration was not a task for hired hands, but a responsibility of vision and determination. The fleet's success depended on discipline, organization, and the collective skill of its sailors, a testament to the sophistication of the Mali Empire and the broader West African civilizations of the era. Despite storms, shipwrecks, and the vast unknown, the mission continued. Each successful landing reinforced the idea that Africa was a global power, capable of crossing oceans and shaping distant lands. The loss of some ships did not deter Abu Bakr or his successors. Their journey was about knowledge, legacy, and the assertion of Africa's rightful place in world history. Modern scholars are beginning to piece together these fragments. Manuscripts in Timbuktu describe the fleet, its objectives, and the lands it reached. Archaeological findings across the Americas support the possibility of pre-Columbian African contact. Oral traditions, passed down through generations, echo the memory of visitors from across the Atlantic. When assembled, these pieces form a coherent picture. Africa did not wait for Europe. Africa discovered, mapped, and understood the world on its own terms. The story of Abu Bakr II is a reminder that history is often written by those who claim power, not by those who hold truth. His expedition was erased, minimized, or misattributed, but it never truly disappeared. The Atlantic remembers. The islands, the coastlines, the currents, all bear silent testimony to a fleet that sailed not for conquest, but for knowledge, curiosity, and the assertion of African ingenuity. Abu Bakr's voyage stands as a testament to what Africa could achieve: mastery of the seas, diplomatic engagement with new cultures, and an intellectual footprint that spanned continents. The evidence, though scattered and often ignored, challenges the dominant narratives of history and restores the African voice to the story of human exploration. Long before Europe claimed the Atlantic, Africa had already reached its shores, and the legacy of Abu Bakr II, the African emperor who crossed the ocean, continues to inspire those who seek the truth, hidden beneath layers of erasure and myth. The world may never have known the full extent of Abu Bakr II's voyages, if not for the few surviving documents and oral histories that stubbornly refuse to vanish. One of the most telling pieces of evidence lies in the maps. For centuries, European cartographers produced maps of the Atlantic and the Americas, routes that were known, currents that were charted, and the very shape of coastlines reflected knowledge that could only have come from experienced African navigators. Yet these maps credited Europeans as if they had invented navigation itself. Consider the trade winds. European explorers centuries later were astonished to find that the Atlantic had predictable patterns, seemingly a natural highway. They marveled at the ability to sail west and return east safely, a discovery that seemed miraculous to them. But these currents had been understood long before by Africans who studied the ocean like one would study a familiar city street. Abu Bakr's fleet didn't stumble blindly into the Atlantic. They knew its rhythm, they followed its pulse, and they used the stars to navigate, creating a mental map of a world few Europeans would see for another 2 centuries. And yet, when European maps began circulating in the 15th and 16th centuries, any evidence of pre-Columbian African presence was omitted. Africa was shown as a passive land of mystery and scarcity. Names were changed, trade routes erased, and settlements that might hint at African contact were ignored. It was a deliberate attempt to control the narrative, to make Europe appear as the hero of the Atlantic, and Africa as the silent waiting bystander. History, in this case, was an act of theft disguised as scholarship. The manuscripts in Timbuktu, written in precise Arabic script, describe the ports, the winds, and the cultures encountered. They were meticulous, scientific records. Some documents even included illustrations of the peoples met along the way, their tools, their dress, and their customs. These records make it clear that the voyages were not casual journeys of curiosity. They were planned expeditions with objectives, logistics, and knowledge sharing in mind. The empire's intellectual tradition ensured that these records were accurate and purposeful. When Abu Bakr returned, or in some cases, when his ships did not, his scholars and scribes documented every detail. Even though the emperor himself may have been lost to the sea, his vision endured through these archives. Each record served as a beacon of African capability, a challenge to the narrative that Africa was late to history. And yet, European powers actively chose to ignore these records, labeling them as peripheral, irrelevant, or even fictional. The erasure was not subtle. Some early European historians went to Timbuktu and other African centers of knowledge, observed the manuscripts, and still concluded that the information must have been derived from Arab traders, conveniently ignoring centuries of African scholarship. This systemic dismissal created the illusion that Africa had been a passive recipient of knowledge, rather than a generator of it. It's important to grasp the magnitude of this erasure. Europe did not merely fail to acknowledge African achievements, it actively redefined history to marginalize African contributions. Maps, books, and oral traditions were manipulated or suppressed. The knowledge that African navigators had crossed the Atlantic, that they had engaged in diplomacy and trade far from their homeland, and that they had documented it in the most precise way possible, was hidden from view. Modern research is only beginning to correct the record. Scholars, analyzing Timbuktu manuscripts, combined with archaeological evidence from the Caribbean, Central, and South America, are piecing together the story. Metalwork, ceramics, and textile patterns reveal unmistakable African origins. Linguistic analysis shows traces of African languages in indigenous terms for technology, trade, and social organization. Even genetic studies hint at early contact between African populations and the Americas. Imagine the implications. Centuries before Columbus, a black African emperor led fleets across the Atlantic, documented his journey, and interacted with the Americas in ways that were never intended to be remembered. This is not a footnote. This is a revolution in understanding history. It overturns the narrative that Europe discovered the New World. It reframes Africa as a center of global exploration, intellect, and influence. And yet, despite centuries of denial, these truths have a stubborn persistence. They exist in manuscripts, hidden in sand, in oral histories passed down for generations, in artifacts buried in the Americas, and in the very currents of the Atlantic that guided Abu Bakr's fleet. The evidence refuses to be erased completely. The map, though altered by Europe, contains ghostly traces of the African presence. It calls on scholars, historians, and the public to question the stories they have been taught, and to seek the hidden paths of truth. Abu Bakr II's Voyages remind us that history is not merely a collection of dates and events. It is a battlefield of memory, where power and narrative collide. The story of the African empire that crossed the ocean is a testament to vision, courage, and intellectual mastery. It is a challenge to every simplified account of exploration. The Atlantic itself, the waves and winds, carries the story of African ingenuity, daring, and foresight. And as researchers continue to uncover manuscripts, artifacts, and oral histories, the full picture of Abu Bakr II's expedition slowly comes into view. What was once considered myth or coincidence is now being recognized as historical fact. The African presence in the pre-Columbian Americas is no longer a question of possibility. It is a matter of documented reality. This is a story about more than one man. It is about a civilization capable of shaping continents, guiding oceans, and influencing history long before Europe ever attempted to cross the Atlantic. It is a story of brilliance erased, then remembered, and it serves as a reminder. History is not static. It is not simply the story of those in power. It is the sum of what people dare to remember, record, and pass down, even when others try to erase it. When Columbus finally arrived in the Caribbean, he didn't land on an empty stage. Indigenous peoples had already been interacting with African explorers for generations. Their oral histories, myths, and accounts describe dark-skinned visitors who came from the east, men wearing gold, wielding advanced metal tools, and speaking languages unlike any spoken locally. These visitors arrived long before the fleets of Europe, and their presence challenged the conventional narrative of discovery. Columbus himself recorded some of these encounters in his journals. He noted descriptions of men with dark skin and unfamiliar customs, yet the Europeans reading and interpreting his journals dismissed them. These were coincidences, he claimed, or miscommunications between travelers. Scholars of the time largely ignored these observations, interpreting them in ways that reinforced the prevailing myth that the New World had been untouched until European arrival. But the indigenous accounts tell a different story, one of familiarity with seafaring Africans, with navigation techniques, and with goods brought across the Atlantic. Archaeological evidence supports these oral testimonies. In various parts of the Caribbean, metalwork resembling West African alloys has been discovered. In South America, some pre-Columbian carvings depict individuals with features characteristic of Niger River populations, full lips, broad noses, and hairstyles identical to those worn in Mali during the 14th century. These findings are more than coincidences. They are fingerprints left by African explorers who charted paths across oceans that Europeans would later claim as their own. Consider the navigational mastery required for such voyages. The Atlantic is treacherous, with currents, storms, and seasonal wind patterns that can easily overwhelm the unprepared. Yet Abu Bakr II's fleet sailed with confidence, guided by the stars, the rhythm of the ocean, and centuries of accumulated knowledge. European explorers who followed in their wake were essentially tracing routes already well established by Africans, routes that allowed them to return home safely. This was not luck, this was science, strategy, and experience encoded into maps and oral traditions. Abu Bakr's ambition was extraordinary. He did not sail merely for conquest or profit. He sought knowledge, exploration, and the expansion of understanding. He built fleets that numbered in the hundreds, perhaps even thousands, and he personally led expeditions across an ocean that most Europeans deemed uncharted and impossible. When only one ship returned, he didn't retreat. He built another fleet, larger and stronger, and prepared to sail again. This was not reckless bravery, it was vision and persistence, hallmarks of African leadership and ingenuity that have too often been overlooked by history. The interaction between African navigators and indigenous peoples was not incidental. Evidence suggests trade, cultural exchange, and even settlement. The tools, metals, and knowledge brought by Africans influenced local technologies and societal organization. While Europe would later impose colonial narratives, enslaving people and claiming discovery as their own, these interactions reveal a more complex history of transatlantic contact. Africa was not a distant, passive observer. It was an active participant, shaping new worlds. Yet European powers were determined to erase this reality. Maps were rewritten, histories were sanitized, and textbooks glossed over or omitted these encounters entirely. Africans were removed from the story of discovery, while indigenous accounts were often suppressed or dismissed as legend. This erasure was not accidental, it was systematic, aimed at controlling the narrative of power, achievement, and civilization. Understanding these early interactions reshapes how we view history. The story of the Americas before Columbus is no longer empty of African influence. Instead, it is a story of shared knowledge, navigational prowess, and cultural transmission. Africans crossed oceans, studied stars, and documented their voyages. Indigenous peoples bore witness to their arrival, integrating their presence into stories passed down through generations. History, in this sense, is not a single perspective, but a tapestry woven from multiple truths, many of which were hidden or ignored for centuries. Recognizing this narrative changes our perception of exploration. Columbus did not discover the New World. He followed in the wake of Africans like Esteval the Moor and Abu Bakr II. The lands were already inhabited, already visited, and already known in ways that challenged the Eurocentric view of history. This acknowledgement honors the courage, intellect, and legacy of African navigators, while restoring agency to indigenous peoples who remembered these encounters. The erasure of this history has consequences. It perpetuates myths of European superiority, marginalizes African achievement, and obscures the reality of pre-Columbian transatlantic exploration. Correcting the record is not merely an academic exercise, it is a reclamation of identity, a recognition of centuries of ingenuity, and a restoration of truth. By understanding these voyages and their witnesses, we confront the biases that shape traditional narratives and reclaim a more accurate, inclusive vision of history. Abu Bakr II's legacy endures not only in manuscripts and artifacts, but also in the memory of the people he encountered. Indigenous testimonies, material evidence, and cultural traces all bear witness to the presence of African explorers in the Americas long before Europe laid claim. And in acknowledging these connections, we not only honor the past, but also redefine the framework through which we understand exploration, power, and human achievement. Africa did not wait to be discovered. Its navigators charted the seas, left their marks across continents, and recorded their knowledge for generations to come. The story of the Americas is incomplete without recognizing their role. Esteval the Moor, Abu Bakr II, and countless unnamed African sailors remind us that history is richer, more interconnected, and far more extraordinary than the simplified versions passed down through textbooks.
Archaeology is often called the science of uncovering the past, but what it unearths can rewrite everything we thought we knew. For decades, researchers have discovered traces of African presence across the Americas long before Columbus arrived. In Brazil, fragments of copper and gold alloys have been found that match the metallurgical practices of 14th century Mali. These aren't crude imitations or coincidental matches. They bear the precision, composition, and craftsmanship characteristic of West African artisans. It's as if Abu Bakr's fleet left fingerprints across the entire hemisphere, and every dig site slowly reveals a new layer of truth. In Mexico, archaeologists unearthed metalwork and carvings displaying facial features and hairstyles unmistakably of African origin. These discoveries align with indigenous oral histories describing visitors from across the Atlantic, men with dark skin, tightly coiled hair, and advanced navigational knowledge. When taken together, the evidence forms a mosaic of African exploration that predates the European age of discovery by nearly 2 centuries. Yet, mainstream history textbooks often dismiss these findings or label them as anomalies. Why? Because they don't fit the narrative of Europe as the sole engine of global discovery. Trade routes further reinforce the presence of Africans in the Americas. Patterns of goods, materials, and cultural practices indicate that transatlantic contact was not accidental but intentional. Africans had already mapped the currents and trade winds long before Columbus's voyage. These natural highways, the Atlantic's conveyor belts of wind and water, were used to navigate fleets of hundreds of ships. West African sailors did not rely solely on compasses. They had centuries of accumulated knowledge, understanding the ocean's rhythm, charting stars, and timing voyages to coincide with the optimal currents. The precision of these expeditions makes it impossible to chalk them up to luck or coincidence. The story of Abu Bakr II himself offers insight into the level of sophistication required for such undertakings. He didn't send small reconnaissance parties.
He built enormous fleets, instructing them in coordinated navigation, celestial observation, and oceanic science. When only a fraction returned, he didn't abandon the project. Instead, he reinforced it, building larger fleets, and setting out personally. This wasn't a gamble. It was strategic vision, calculated with the knowledge of generations. His ambition was not conquest, but discovery, a thirst for understanding that challenged the boundaries of the known world. Consider the societal structures that enabled such a feat. Mali was not a small, isolated kingdom. It was one of the richest civilizations in human history, with centers of learning like Timbuktu producing scholars in law, astronomy, and literature. These intellectual hubs nurtured navigators capable of charting vast oceans. Knowledge flowed freely across the empire, connecting cities, rivers, and ports in a network that supported the logistics of transatlantic voyages. Europe, still entrenched in the Dark Ages, was catching up to concepts of navigation, astronomy, and geography that Africa had already mastered. But despite the evidence, Western historians have repeatedly minimized African contributions. When traces of African metalwork appeared in the Americas, scholars often labeled it imported from Arabs or anomalous trade. When indigenous accounts described African visitors, they were dismissed as legend. By removing Africans from these stories, European narratives elevated themselves as the first and only discoverers of the New World. History became a tool of control, selectively rewritten to legitimize colonial and imperial power. The erasure is not complete. Every artifact, every manuscript, and every oral history provides a thread back to the truth. Timbuktu's libraries preserve manuscripts detailing astronomy, navigation, and maritime knowledge. The materials and techniques recorded in these manuscripts match archaeological finds in the Caribbean and South America. This evidence paints a picture of African explorers moving methodically, deliberately, and successfully across the Atlantic centuries before Europe claimed its first discoveries. These discoveries also challenge assumptions about global knowledge exchange. Africa was not a passive recipient of ideas. It was a generator, a source of innovation, and a conduit for exploration. By the time Europeans attempted transatlantic navigation, Africans had already mastered the science and art of oceanic travel. The story of the Americas, without Africa, is incomplete, sanitized, skewed, and deliberately misleading. Recognizing the truth restores agency and acknowledges the ingenuity, courage, and foresight of African civilizations. Finally, the human element cannot be ignored. These voyages were not just technical achievements, they were acts of vision, ambition, and bravery. Men like Abu Bakr II and Esteval the Moor risked their lives to chart unknown waters. They engaged with indigenous peoples, left cultural and material imprints, and expanded the boundaries of human understanding. Their legacy survives not only in artifacts, but in the stories, the evidence, and the continents that remember their presence. Africa did not wait to be discovered. It crossed oceans, explored continents, and left enduring marks that question the narrative Europe tried to impose. The discoveries beneath the sand, hidden in manuscripts, and etched in memory, all converge to tell a single truth. Africans were not passengers in history. They were pioneers, visionaries, and explorers whose impact resonates across the Atlantic even today. By now, the story should be clear. The narrative that Columbus discovered America is not only incomplete, it's deliberately misleading. Africa was not waiting. Africa was exploring. Africa was leading. And the men who sailed across the Atlantic centuries before European powers did so were not explorers in search of conquest. They were visionaries, scientists, and dreamers who sought knowledge, understanding, and the expansion of human potential. King Abu Bakr II of Mali and Esteval the Moor were more than just voyagers. They were symbols of an African legacy,
that European powers spent centuries trying to erase. These men understood the ocean, the stars, and the natural world in ways that rivaled or exceeded the navigational knowledge of Europe at the time. Their expeditions were meticulously planned, their fleets formidable, and their ambition to reach lands beyond sight reflected an intellectual curiosity that defied the Eurocentric notion that innovation belonged exclusively to the West. And yet, when these fleets reached distant shores, when indigenous peoples recorded encounters with African sailors, the stories were buried. Maps were redrawn, chronicles were rewritten, and textbooks were sanitized. Columbus became the discoverer, while the true pioneers, black explorers, were erased from history. This was no accident. It was a systematic effort to control the narrative, to maintain the illusion of European supremacy, and to obscure Africa's immense contributions to global civilization. But history cannot be erased entirely. Evidence remains, scattered across continents, waiting to be recognized. Timbuktu's manuscripts, hidden in clay walls for centuries, continue to reveal African mastery of astronomy, mathematics, law, and medicine. Archaeological discoveries in the Americas hint at African presence long before Columbus, and oral histories, preserved through generations, testify to voyages that shaped the cultural and scientific landscape of the world. This evidence is undeniable. It speaks with clarity and authority. Africans sailed across the Atlantic long before Europeans claimed the oceans as their own. Understanding this history is more than just a matter of setting the record straight. It's about reclaiming identity, dignity, and pride. For too long, narratives of exploration, discovery, and achievement have excluded African voices, minimizing their role in shaping the modern world. Recognizing the truth about Abu Bakr II and Esteval the Moor restores that missing piece, illuminating the brilliance, courage, and intellect of African civilizations. It is a powerful reminder that knowledge, skill, and ingenuity have never been confined to a single continent or people. The story also challenges us to rethink what we mean by discovery. The oceans were never empty, nor were they waiting for European ships. Knowledge was already present, developed, and applied by African navigators who understood the seas, winds, and stars. Indigenous peoples recognized them. The earth had been mapped in practice, if not in European records. To discover something that is already known by another is not discovery, it is appropriation. And that is precisely what happened for centuries in history books. So what does this mean for us today? It means we must examine the sources of our knowledge critically. We must question whose stories have been amplified and whose have been silenced. We must dig deeper, uncover more manuscripts, re-examine archaeological finds, and amplify oral histories that have endured against tremendous odds. We must understand that history is not static. It is alive, evolving, and shaped by those who dare to challenge the dominant narrative. The legacy of African exploration is not just a story of the past, it is a call to the present and future. It reminds us that curiosity, courage, and intellect are not bound by skin color or geography. It reminds us that African civilizations were leaders, innovators, and global influencers long before Europe asserted its dominance. And it challenges us to carry forward that legacy, to explore, to create, and to lead with the same vision and determination as those who first charted the Atlantic. Finally, this history teaches humility and reverence. It teaches us that the world is far more interconnected, diverse, and complex than the simplified narratives we often accept. Africa's explorers did not just navigate seas, they navigated knowledge itself, charting a course for humanity that has been hidden but never lost. By reclaiming this truth, we honor the ancestors, preserve their contributions, and ensure that future generations understand the full story, a story of African ingenuity, bravery, and global impact. So remember, The world's oceans were crossed by black hands long before Europe set sail. The maps were drawn by African minds, the stars read by African eyes, and the legacy of that knowledge lives on today. History may have been buried, erased, or rewritten, but the truth cannot be denied. Africa was not discovered, Africa led, and the explorers who first crossed the Atlantic, Abu Bakr II, Esteval the Moor, and countless unnamed navigators, remind us that greatness has always emerged from Africa, shaping the world in ways we are only beginning to fully understand. The story doesn't end here. It is being rediscovered, remembered, and retold. And the moment you acknowledge it, the narrative shifts. Africa is not a footnote in history. It is the author of continents, the navigator of oceans, and the origin of civilization itself. And that is a truth that no one, no empire, no colonizer, no false narrative can ever erase.